moving on then. I still haven't finished with the Would You Rather game, so we're not gonna put the end to that. I'm gonna bring that back in a minute, but I think it's probably the right time just to talk a little bit about this this potential SPAC, right? So I don't know whoever hasn't seen it or has seen it, but essentially there's this guy called Jeffrey Soros, the nephew of one of humanity's most controversial philanthropists. Some people he's got the best PR in the world, who say that everything he does is philanthropic by nature. He's a multiple billionaire who essentially tried to bankrupt the Bank of England back in the 80s by shorting the pound against the dollar and against half a dozen other currencies, and he had the weight behind him, and he tried to bankrupt the Bank of England, which set our inflation up to 19% at one point, I think it was, and interest rates had to go up to extortionate amounts of money. So your parents, whoever's watching, who probably had mortgages at the time, were probably paying extortionate amounts of interest because of what this guy did. So, he ruined us. He ruined Thailand. He ruined Malaysia, doing the same sort of tactics. He's somebody that he likes to take situations when countries or companies are in trouble and buries them. His nephew is going to be no different. The apple doesn't fall far from the uncle's tree, so to speak. But his nephew, Jeffrey Soros, is a multiple millionaire who owns a SPAC, which is a special purpose acquisition company. And I'll talk about what they are in a minute. But essentially, this company is called LAMF Global Ventures. This is a Los Angeles-based special acquisition company, special purpose acquisition company. They only went live on their IPO on the American stock market back in November for $200 million. But what a SPAC does, if people don't know, if you are interested, just briefly, a SPAC looks for a private company. Generally speaking, they're super micro companies that are high growth, usually startups that are in the tech space. And those companies need lots of, they burn through cash like it's going out of fashion whilst they're trying to grow. And a SPAC is like a very new kind of 2020. It's only been around for a couple of years. It's a new system where these companies will come in and they'll they'll buy the company essentially for a certain valuation, and then they'll fund that company's operation until the company is ready to launch on its own on the stock market. But they'll launch via the SPAC rather than via their own rights, because a lot of private companies don't survive long enough to get to the point where they can launch on the stock market. And so a SPAC comes in to bridge the gap. SPACs were all the rage over the last 2 or 3 years. A lot of people lost a lot of money when the bubble burst in 2021 because there was money just going left and right, people overpaying for companies. It's not something that would make any sense, in my opinion, for Tottenham Hotspur to do. Tottenham Hotspur used to be on the London Stock Exchange. And fun fact, I didn't realize this until the other day when I was playing golf with my dad. My dad was a stockbroker who worked for a company called Yamichi back in the 80s and the early 90s. He was actually responsible. He was the stockbroker who sold Terry Venable's stake in Tottenham Hotspur behind Alan Sugar's back and pissed the fuck out of Alan Sugar. And my dad was the stockbroker responsible for the trade, which is quite a little interesting thing I didn't know anything about. So I might get my dad on the podcast one day to explain all that stuff in the future. But Tottenham have no need. Tottenham have absolutely no desire to have to go via a SPAC. If they wanted to go back to try and go via an IPO to get money through relisting on the stock exchange, they don't need to go via a SPAC to do it. If they were to do it via a SPAC, I don't know why they would choose to use a company that's only worth $200 million themselves, and a Los Angeles company that, whilst they might be interested, the guy Jeffrey Soros all they do is make documentaries and TV series. They're interested in sports, and they'd like to buy a club or whatever. But for me, Tottenham Hotspur is far too big. I don't think there's any sense to it, any logic to it. And certainly, Kev Williams was asking the question: is it better the devil you know? We've gone through this several times, guys, on this podcast and on different podcasts. I've been asked about who would buy Tottenham, who can afford Tottenham. There's very few people that can afford Tottenham. If you wanted to find someone that has the money, that has the interest to be able to take on certain levels of the property or the investments that Tottenham have got, all of the other responsibilities of running a football club, you're already kind of filtering down and leaving yourself with an even fewer amount of reliable candidates, and most of those people would come from overseas. There's very few Saudi Arabian families. Like all of the oil wealth that's in Saudi Arabia, it's basically owned between a dozen or so, or not even a dozen major families. And they're all kind of interconnected anyway. But because Newcastle are owned by one of them, because Manchester City's owned by one of them, because there's money coming into Everton via the same things and also into Southampton, I'm not entirely sure if there's any money that could come from that area that's still available to purchase another football club in the Premier League without being considered to have a conflict of interests. Also, you have to factor in all of the kind of human rights issues that we've spoken about time and time again. Do you want to be owned by a club? Where do you draw the line in the sand? For me, human rights and murder and all that stuff, and is something, misogyny and sexism, feminism, anti-gay, all those sorts of things would be something that would be a difficult pill for me to swallow, and I guess would be for most reasonable fans. You could argue the same thing about Russian money. And so you're left with American money or North American money, which comes from leveraged debt. A SPAC isn't leveraged debt, so it's not as bad as what you would see with Manchester United. It's a different style of debt. It's not got the same problems associated with it, but I just don't think Daniel Levy and ENIC have any need or interest in going down that path. It's not a quick sell for them, and it wouldn't make any sense doing it via a SPAC. Rather, they could just go straight back to the London Stock Exchange and get a company like JP Morgan or Goldman Sachs to underwrite their own listing if they wanted to do that. So they could eventually find the new CEO to buy the majority of the shares via investment funds, like, take your pick. Like I say, or any investment fund or hedge fund that would want to have a slice of the pie. But again, that doesn't leave us with any real owner. Doesn't leave us with anyone that can face the accountability. And also, those people, they're not going to throw money at Tottenham just like everyone would hope they would, right? Like they're money men who want to see return on investment. And so I don't think this makes sense. I don't think the leveraged buyout stuff would make sense either. And I don't particularly want Russian or oil money to come in. So that's why I've always been kind of somewhat pro Levy in the eyes of the communities, because I think that the better the devil you know, Kev, is a point that I would stand by. And certainly these guys with Soros, anything attached to Soros, not for me. That guy's got a lot of skeletons in his closet, and I don't particularly want those skeletons or those tentacles of his influence over Tottenham Hotspur. I don't know if that made sense or if that was a 5-minute boring rant.
No, 100%. 100%. I think there's a reason Soros sounds like a Doctor Who villain. He does. If they were to take us over, I fear for the actual existence of the club. I think we'd be gutted and falling down divisions. I really do. They're not interested in the success of the club in the slightest. I mean, it would be like a worse version of ENIC.
Yeah.
Why do they want the club now? It's because they see it as an opportunity to make even more money. Yeah. That's better the devil you know. I always say ENIC out, but it isn't for anybody. There are some people we just turn down.
Yeah. Okay.
Well, I mean, I don't see ENIC selling any. If they're bidding for the Super Bowl, they're not a club looking to sell, are they? Just first and foremost, if they win the Super Bowl, they're going to make minimum £600 million. They're going to pay off most of the stadium within a day if they get the Super Bowl. So a team that's bidding for the Super Bowl is not looking to sell. So any sort of bid to sell the club, whether it's Forest Lee, who I desperately don't want either, I feel like absolutely nothing to do with any sort of things to do with Forest Lee. I feel like Forest Lee is one of those people with skeletons in his closet, as just like Jeffrey Soros is. But I don't think we're selling the club anytime soon, especially if we're bidding for the Super Bowl, because that would solve all our problems immediately if we get the Super Bowl from a debt perspective. So it'd be amazing. It'd be amazing, and everyone,
people that get frustrated by Tottenham, holding Adele concerts or whatever at the stadium. I mean, I understand.
Concerts. Phil would love an Adele concert,
or whatever, right? If the Brits are held there at some point, or whatever, the Super Bowl, all of that stuff. I think it's great. It's great for brand Tottenham Hotspur. It does bring a lot of money into the coffers. And I don't think it doesn't. I don't think it undermines the brand. I understand why people are like, well, it's turning Tottenham Hotspur into something that's not all about football. But, for me, it's a double-edged sword, right? You have to, and we went through those figures when Dave was on this show a couple of weeks ago. Even with the stadium the size that it is, taking away all the debt, you're still only making 40% of your salary bill. And if you want to be able to have a team that can compete for the Premier League in a couple of seasons, you're going to need to have a £300 million salary bill, because you're going to need to go and buy 4 or 5 players that are all on. Ideally, you want the best players, and so you want them to have the best money. But you want 200 grand a week players in the positions that we don't have them, and so you're going to need to find ways to make ends meet. And Champions League football is not something that you can rely on. Even if you get it this season, there's no guarantee you're going to get it next season. Especially when you've got Newcastle coming up, you've got Aston Villa making moves. You've got Leicester that are having a bad season. Maybe they're going to be competing and competitive going forward. West Ham have got money to spend from their Russian investors. So, you do need these other additional sources of revenue, because the holy grail of revenue obviously is the Champions League. But there's so many teams that are chomping at the bit to close the gap. And so, for me, the Super Bowl will be a great little money earner. Obviously, the stadium naming rights is probably 30-40 million quid a season that we haven't yet tapped into. And I don't know, there's no update there. But, to whoever asked about Forest Lee, I think, Ben, you mentioned it as well. But Forest Lee would be a nice little one. But we haven't. That's all quiet on that front ever since that news we had. That was, in early January when Daniel Levy was over in Barbados. There's nothing more about that. So.
Must have certainly been close to something there, though. I mean, went to an awful lot of rolling out the red carpet for him, showing him around. So must have been something close.
Yeah. Yeah, Zoe's asking, is there any chance we aren't selling the naming rights because of this potential takeover investment? I mean, look, it's a good point. If there was someone who wanted to come in and it was a company that had a brand that made sense, like an Amazon. I know we always use Amazon as a great gimme, but it's there's no real reason to think that there's anything there. No one's ever mentioned Jeff Bezos' interest in buying a football club, but obviously that would be one that would make sense. The Amazon Arena does sound cool as well.
Full on delusion.
Yeah, the delusion pit is swelling. It's swelling down here. But listen, I mean, I wouldn't say Zoe. I mean, it makes sense what you're saying, Zoe, but we haven't sold the naming rights for the last 4 years, so I think it's more likely they're just trying to find someone who's willing to pay whatever ridiculous asking price they have for it. And it's actually interesting that the stadiums with apart from I think it's Atletico Madrid Stadium that has the highest naming rights deal in world football. Turkey have got 2 stadiums that have got the second and third highest naming rights deals. It's really odd. Like I was looking through that the other day.
There's something going on there, isn't there? I don't want to comment on it. But, I mean, back to the whole Super Bowl thing, I think there is an additional source of revenue that they're probably not talking about yet, because with Tottenham bidding for the Super Bowl, they must be looking on building another NFL franchise. We know the NFL are desperate to branch out into Europe because they're not making enough money. They need more eyes on the product, because only having an American sport in America is not going to get many eyes on the sport. So they're already looking on finding a franchise in Germany. And if they're looking at a franchise in Germany, they're looking at a franchise in London, because London is the biggest city on planet Earth, in my opinion. And it is to the majority of a lot of people. And I think Tottenham Hotspur will have an NFL team in the next 10 years. And I seriously think that's going to happen. And not only are Tottenham going to get the Super Bowl in 2026, because the NFL would love to have the Super Bowl in London, I see there being a London franchise within the next 20 years. 10, 20 years.
Hopefully it won't take 20 years. Hopefully in the next 5 or 6. I think one of the Florida teams is they basically have 0. Like they have a half-empty stadium every week.
I think that's the Jaguars, isn't it?
Yeah, Jacksonville, yeah. So I think
he's not going to have his team play at Tottenham because he owns Fulham.
Oh, but he'd lose the franchise. I think he would give up the franchise altogether.
Possibly, but that would be upsetting, because I've got a friend that supports Jacksonville Jaguars, and to see him lose his team would be awful.
Ah, well. Someone...
At least he could support the same team.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so listen, I don't know if you guys got anything more. I don't want to spend too much talking about it, because I don't think there's any real truth to the story anyway. It was only mentioned really in the Daily Record. It was written by a fairly Duncan Castles is obviously a fairly he's not an incredible journalist. So I don't know where he got the story from, but it wasn't really picked up by anyone. The only other kind of news sites that were talking about it were just syndicators that took the story and ran with it. But I don't think there's much to it. But I just wanted to cover it off. And for anyone that came along to hear that take on it, then I hope that kind of answers your question. SPAC is watch the numbers go.
I didn't know whether to dare make a joke about don't want to be run by a bunch of SPACers as well.
Well, you made it now.
Golden Cocker said, wasn't Cleveland mentioned also? If Tottenham have the Tottenham Browns, that would be the worst named team on the planet.
Wow,
the only thing Brown is my trousers after watching Dyer and Sanchez at the back for 5 years.
Yeah. Cleveland Browns, wowzers. Awful. All right, so let's get back to Tottenham.